Hello everyone and welcome back to the Airfix YouTube channel. In this video we're going to build and paint another one of the new Airfix starter sets. It's the 1/43rd scale Aston Martin DB5. A star of the big screen as well as on the road, this truly iconic car is a very popular subject with model makers, and inside this box we have not only the model kit, but because it's a starter set we have the glue, a paintbrush and 4 acrylic paints to paint the model. On the back of the box you'll find the usual full colour diagrams detailing the colour scheme, and these are provided in actual size. The callouts for the included paints are shown in the small clear rectangular boxes that label the diagram, and in the small red boxes you'll find numbered callouts for the detailed transfer sheet, which is also supplied in the kit. Inside the box you'll find a plastic bag containing 2 frames of grey injection moulded plastic handling all the details, and a single piece body shell. In a separate bag inside here you'll find a clear part detailing all of the windows and the windscreen. In the small bag you'll find 4 Humbrol acrylic paints to paint the model and a small tube of Humbrol polycement. There's also a number 2 sized Humbrol Airfix paintbrush supplied to paint the kit. The transfer sheet deals with the number plates, the dials for the dashboard and all of the car's badges and emblems. And of course there's a fully detailed instruction guide showing every step of the build from start to finish, and it is important that you give this a read before you start your project to make sure that you build everything in sequence and don't miss any of the parts. There's also a before you start guide which details the common tools and processes involved in model building, and we're going to carry out step 1, which is to wash all of the parts with soapy water before we begin our build. The basic toolkit that we'll be using to build the kit comprises of a set of cutters to remove parts from the frame, a modelling knife to trim away any excess plastic left behind, a modelling file from the Humbrol toolset to sand the plastic smooth after removal, and a set of tweezers to help when applying the transfers. This is a very basic toolkit, well within the reach of even the most novice modellers. The detail parts are supplied on frames with a large identifying number moulded into them, and next to each part you'll find a small tab on the frame which has a letter and a number moulded into it, and this is the part number which is referenced in the round callouts in the instructions to help you select the correct parts for each step. As we get started with the build we can see that straight away there's a requirement to paint some parts with the interior brown, and we're going to do this while the parts are still attached to the frame just to keep everything organised and assist with handling. After selecting the correct paint from the small bag, we opened it to find that the paint had separated while the kit was in storage. All we needed to do to fix this was to give the paint a quick stir, and after about 20 seconds it was totally mixed again and ready to use. We transferred some of the interior brown into the palette using the paintbrush supplied with the kit before diluting it about 30% with ordinary tap water. This just helps the paint to flow smoothly and allows us to build up colour with thin layers which don't leave behind any 3-dimensional texture. Because we're applying our initial coat directly over bare plastic, there may be some areas where surface tension prevents the paint from sticking. In these areas we use short fast strokes of the brush to overcome the surface tension just to get that initial coat of the brown paint down on the model. While that's drying we skipped ahead in the instructions and painted all of the parts which are called out in interior brown so that we had them all ready for the assembly in the later stages. Once that initial coat of paint is dry you'll notice that it's a little bit streaky because of the added water. We can then go ahead and add a second coat over the top just to build up strong colour coverage. The addition of the water to the paint does reduce the opacity, however by building up the colour in 2 thin layers we avoid any 3-dimensional texture. The light grey paint supplied with the kit was given a good stir before being transferred to the palette and diluted with yet again 30% ordinary tap water. This was then used to paint the dashboard, and we just had to take care not to get any of the light grey on the upper portion of the dash where we'd painted the brown interior colour already. Once we'd got the initial coat down on the dashboard, we skipped ahead on the instructions again and painted the underside of the car, which is also called out in light grey. Because we're painting a light coloured paint onto a dark grey plastic, the initial coat is going to look very streaky, but it's there almost to act as a primer, so we're not worried about coverage at this point, just making sure it goes down nice and even. Once the initial coat has been left to dry, a second coat can be applied to build up colour coverage, and on the underside of the vehicle this is very noticeable as we apply our additional coat of paint that all of the streaks are disappearing under a nice layer of light grey paint. With everything painted and left to dry fully, it's time to remove the parts from the frame and commence assembly. We're using the cutters to cut the frame connection points, but we're doing this slightly away from the surface of the parts themselves. This is to prevent any damage, but it does leave behind a small piece of the frame protruding from the surface. This is easily trimmed away with the modelling knife, and then we can sand the surface flush using the file. We want to get rid of any evidence of that frame connection point, leaving behind a nice smooth surface. But this of course does remove some of the paint that we've applied, so we just need to touch this in once we're happy with the way the plastic has been sanded down. Now that it's time to glue the parts together, we're going to be working with the polycement supplied with the kit. Polycement is supplied in a small metal tube, but it does have quite a broad nozzle, and this can make control quite difficult for beginner modelers. So what we like to do is cut the upper portion of the model kit box away to create an applicator, and then cut one of the box flaps just to create a small palette. We can now add our polycement onto the small palette section, and then use the applicator that we've cut from the box to apply the glue to the model. First of all, the parts are put together without any glue in a process referred to as dry fitting to make sure everything fits together perfectly, and then we can apply the polycement with the applicator before pressing the parts together into their final position. After a few seconds, the polycement will take hold and those two pieces are assembled. We can then repeat this basic assembly process for the front seats on the vehicle, touching in the connection points which we've sanded down, adding the polycement and then gluing the seats into position. Once both of the front seats are fitted, we then have to remove the dashboard from the frame and clean it up when we encounter the first of the transfers that we need to apply. Transfers don't work like stickers, and instead they have to be cut free from the backing sheet using the modelling knife before they are immersed for a few seconds in ordinary tap water and then left to soak. When they're ready, the transfer will move under pressure from a paintbrush, and we can add just a drop of water to the surface of the model before sliding the transfer into place. Once both of the dials have been added to the dashboard, we can leave this to dry, and that assembly is complete and ready to be fitted to the model. With the polycement added on the single connection point, the dashboard is pressed into place, and we can then go ahead and add the polycement as instructed in the instructions before pressing the door cards into position, completing the assembly of the interior section. The next parts we're going to be working with are for the underside of the car, and these are cleaned up but left attached to the frame for ease of painting. The excess plastic is snipped away with the cutters and the connection points filed down. The same is done on the axles, and then the black paint supplied with the kit is given a good stir, transferred to the palette and diluted with 30% tap water before we start painting the parts. As with the previous parts of the kit that we've painted already, these are given an initial coat which is left to dry and then a second coat over the top to solidify the colour. Once all the paint is dry, they're snipped from the frame and the connection points touched in. The axles are placed into position on their locating slots but not glued in place. Polycement is then added on the floor pan and front and rear chassis as per the yellow areas in the instructions, and the subframe is manoeuvred into position. There are some locating pegs which are pushed into place and then held for a few seconds while the glue takes hold. The next part of the kit to get some attention is the engine and exhaust section. This was given a base coat of the matte black paint, over which we painted 2 coats of silver. The matte black helps to enhance the shine of the silver paint and also works as a primer, helping the paint to stick. Once this has been allowed to dry, it can be snipped from the frame, the connection points touched up, and then the polycement added as per the instructions. Once the glue is in position, the assembly can be manoeuvred under the subframe and then pushed into place. After a few seconds, the glue holds and the engine and exhaust assembly is complete, and the underside of the car is finished, and we can move on. Next up, it was time to paint the single piece body shell. The light grey paint supplied with the kit was transferred to the palette before being diluted with the usual 30% tap water. We then set about applying our initial coat of paint, and you can see straight away that the reduced opacity of the diluted paint leaves this really streaky finish. That's not the key at this point, however. We just want to get that initial coat of paint down over the whole surface, and the extra water that's mixed in will allow it to self-level, doing away with any three-dimensional texture and leaving us with a really nice smooth surface. That's the real key, to get the surface as smooth as possible, as this is an automotive model and we want it to have a nice shiny finish. Brush strokes and other textures in the paint will catch the light and ruin the illusion of our kit. The trade-off between having this paint self-leveling on the surface is that we have to add several coats to build up the colour coverage. But it's a worthwhile trade-off, as we're obviously building a model of a very shiny classic car and we want it to have as smooth a finish as possible. After applying about 4 layers of paint, we're left with a wonderfully smooth finish on this part of the model, and we can go ahead and progress onto the last stages of the build. Next, we're going to add the windows, and these were snipped from the clear frame using the cutters and then cleaned up in the same fashion as the rest of the parts from the kit. A little bit of extra care was taken because the clear plastic is more brittle, and then the body shell was placed on tissue to protect the paintwork, and the rear window assembly pressed into place. There's no need for any poly cement, there's just a really positive click and the rear windows are fitted. The windscreen was removed from the clear frame and cleaned up in the same fashion, and then the windscreen wipers were carefully picked out using matte black. Once the matte black paint had been allowed to dry, we applied 2 coats of silver. Any overspill from this paint can be scratched away with a cocktail stick. A small sliver of the applicator was then cut away, and we used this tiny piece of cardboard to apply small dots of poly cement around the lip of the windscreen mounting area. This was done all the way around as quickly as possible to avoid the poly cement drying, and then the windscreen was pushed into place and held for a few seconds. Moving on to the rest of the details, these were all left attached to the frame, but given a couple of coats of matte black, and as always we diluted this slightly with tap water. The outside of the wheels were paid particular attention, making sure to get the black paint between all of the spokes. To paint the grille, we loaded the brush with silver paint and then rubbed most of it away on a piece of tissue. The brush was then gently rubbed across the raised surfaces to catch just the outside edge of the grille, leaving the black paint in the recesses to act as a false shadow. This is commonly referred to as dry brushing. Once we'd completed that, poly cement was added to the supports behind the grille, and it was then removed from the frame and pushed into position. With silver paint loaded into the palette, we gave the front and rear bumpers 2 coats each, with the black base coat helping to really enhance the shine. At this stage we also painted the outside of the wheels. Instead of giving these a full coat of silver, we allowed the bristles to ride over the detail, catching only the outside edges, leaving the black paint in the deepest recesses to act as a false shadow. With the paint drying on all the detail parts, it was time to close up the body shell. We added poly cement in all the areas marked yellow on the instructions, and then guided the shell over the interior assembly, pressing it neatly into place. This was held for a few seconds while the poly cement took hold, and then it was time to remove the bumper from the frame, clean it up, and then add poly cement in the locating slot on the front and push it into position. The same process was repeated on the rear bumper, folding it around the vehicle to meet the recesses that are moulded into the lower half. With the bumper fitted, it was time to add the covers over the headlights, but first these needed a quick paint with silver paint just to differentiate them from the body. Once the lights were painted, the covers were snipped from the clear frame, small dots of poly cement added, and then these parts were pushed into place. The wheels and tyres were snipped from the frame before poly cement was added all the way around the lip on the inside face of the tyre. This was done towards the centre of the part to avoid the glue squeezing out when the tyre was pushed into place, and we also glued the 2 connection points back to back, so clean-up was a single process rather than cleaning away 2 connection points. With this area touched up with black paint, we then just added a dab of poly cement along the inside face of the axle and pressed the wheels into position. Because the end of each axle has a nice wide surface to glue the wheel onto, alignment was simple and we only needed to carry out a quick visual check to make sure everything was nice and straight. The ultimate test came when all 4 wheels were added and we put the model down on the bench. All 4 wheels touched the surface, so we know everything's aligned perfectly and we can move on to the final stage, adding the markings. The markings were cut from the backing sheet using the modelling knife, immersed in water for a few seconds and then left to soak. After about a minute, the marking moves free of the backing, so with just a touch of water on the surface of the model, the transfers slid into place and final positioning is done with the back of the modelling knife. The smaller ones slid into place perfectly first time and everything was left to dry, and that completes the build and paint of the Airfix Aston Martin DB5 starter set. The new range of starter sets from Airfix is specifically engineered to have a reduced parts count and an improved build sequence. That makes them equally suitable for complete beginners or more experienced modelers looking for a small fun project in between larger models. By offering a subject such as the Aston Martin DB5 in this format, it puts a good finish of a popular subject well within reach of even the most novice modeler. By providing these videos, we hope to provide some guidance and inspiration as you journey deeper into the hobby, gaining valuable experience from these starter sets to carry forward into your next build. So as always, thank you very much for watching and we'll see you again next time.